Ken is traveling this week, so we are playing an episode from the vault. Although new examples could be added if this were being released live, the principles in this episode remain relevant to current events. We'll have a new episode for you next week, but we hope you enjoy this episode on the principles of just war.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about a really interesting subject, kind of spurned from our last conversation we had with Dr. Dan Justice about the concept of just war and what that means. And so, Ken, thanks for spending time with us and helping us think through this and break that down. So why don't you tell us, first of all, what do you mean just war?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic because we could start with the question that's probably on everybody's mind, which is, can war ever be justified? Or said another way, is war ever just? And that's really what we want to talk about today. It's interesting to me, I've been a Christian for, a long time now. And the only time in my entire life that I've ever heard the concept of just war discussed is when I was attending undergraduate at Princeton University from a Christian ethicist named Horton Davies. Now he's no longer with us, he's with the Lord. And I doubt very much that a man like him would ever be hired at Princeton University in the current environment. But he was the one who first taught me about just war. And this is an idea that goes back all the way to St. Augustine or St. Augustine, depending on how you may have been taught to say his name. And for our listeners who don't know who St. Augustine was, he's considered one of the four greatest theologians of the church. And he lived in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, dying in the year, I don't remember now if it was 430 or 431, but he lived to see, most of the destruction that would come upon Rome. And, he lived in the time after the legalization of Christianity. And so he was a great theological thinker. And he actually articulated what came to be known as just war theory as the church taught it through the centuries.
I got you. And so the idea, I assume, would be, how do you rationalize going to war versus the commandment of thou shalt not kill, versus the commandment from Jesus about turn the other cheek and all of that sort of thing. So what do we do with all of that? I guess that's what this whole theory is helping us suss out.
Yeah, that's right. So we'll get more deeply into this in a moment, but in the Ten Commandments, the command that is translated "thou shalt not kill" actually refers to murder. So it contemplates by its language in Hebrew at least the possibility that there might be times when killing might be justified or legitimized. That's different from murder. Murder is generally viewed as something between two individuals or maybe a very small group of individuals. We think of mass murder. So it's something like that, where it's really a non-state actor that is involved. This is, by the way, why when you run into some Christian circles, not all agree with this, but in some Christian circles, there are those who believe that, for example, capital punishment is acceptable. It's because the agent of death is the state. It's not something that becomes an ad hominem issue. Ad hominem is a Latin term that means to the person or to the man. And it really refers to, for example, if you and I had a personal fight that we wanted to settle and I killed you as part of that conflict, whether accidentally or on purpose. If it's accidental, we tend to classify that as manslaughter. And then we have degrees of that: involuntary and voluntary manslaughter. Whereas if it's intentional, then it's viewed as murder, whether in the first, second, or third degree. So this idea of thou shalt not kill actually means you shall not murder. You shall not engage in ad hominem, settling of disputes between yourselves in the form of, say, a feud, maybe a personal militia, or if it's maybe, a love triangle. You're not allowed to kill the offending party that has intervened in your marriage, even though it's not okay what they did. That, in other words, the scripture is saying that's not an acceptable way of resolving that very serious conflict. So that's what we're talking about when we say do not kill. Now, you brought up a second one, which just now I can't remember what it was. What was the second thing?
Jesus about turn the other cheek, to the eye, that sort of thing.
So the second thing that you brought up was Jesus' command to turn the other cheek. And this really comes directly out of the Sermon on the Mount. And this is intended to be the personal ethics, in other words, the individual code of those who are kingdom citizens. So Grant Pemberton, this is how you are to live. Ken Fish, this is how you are to live. If we have a Christian society, these might be the principles by which we live in society. But the scripture makes it clear in the book of Romans, Paul speaks of this, that the Lord appoints authorities, and we don't always like who those authorities are, but one of those functions of authority, as Paul says, is to bear the sword. In other words, to conduct war when war is needed, which again brings us back to, when is war ever just? When is there a time when war is in fact needed? And if we were going to go to war, when, if ever, could it be justified? And so when we hear about turning the other cheek, we have to be careful not to take what is meant to be a personal ethic imposed upon individual believers and impose it on the whole of a society. I think a lot of the conflicts we have politically in America are when we take things that are supposed to be personal ethics and we try to nationalize them. And I think both the left and the right do this. For example, I think we are commanded that we should care for the poor and we should take care of strangers. We try to turn these into widespread social programs. This is particularly true on the left end of the political spectrum. Those commandments in Scripture, sometimes the Scripture gets quoted, or in the past has gotten quoted in justification of this approach. Those commands in Scripture are universally given to believers, that you yourself ought to carry yourself this way, not expect the state to carry it out for you.
So what about applying that logic, just to sort of push on that a bit, to things like abortion, where some could say that the right is trying to force what may be their own individual beliefs onto society? Is that the same kind of thing, or would that be different?
Well, I think from a moral standpoint, the reason the right fights against abortion, although I don't often hear people articulate it this way, the reason they do it is they view abortion as fundamentally immoral because it involves the killing of innocents. And this, by the way, is one of the tenets of just war. We'll get to it in a moment, but we are not allowed to kill the innocent. And so children, by their definition, especially in the womb, they've never had a chance to do right or wrong. And so the idea of killing them indiscriminately, merely because it satisfies either what's viewed as a social good, i.e. controlling population, maybe another social good, that it reduces the demand on social services, or we might say a personal good, that I can go about my career, I'm not disrupted in my lifestyle. Any of these might be used as a justification for abortion. All of these are viewed as inadequate for the justification that's brought forward for the killing of the innocent. This is really what's behind, I think, most of what the right says, and this is why they say abortion is wrong under all circumstances, because they say even a child conceived in rape didn't choose to be conceived and has done nothing wrong. I recognize that for a lot of our listeners, this is like jarring to even hear, and I'm not necessarily advocating as much as I'm trying to articulate, because I don't think these things are often clearly articulated in the public square, and that's really what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, a lot of these issues, it's hard to be discussed without emotion getting involved.
That's
and
right.
I'm emotionally dead inside, so this is perfect for me to talk about this. But I do think there does need to be some just sort of a fleshing out of what each thought is, so that we can articulate what we believe in a reasonable fashion. And so I think this is really helpful. So when we're talking about whether you've got the morality issue of killing the innocent,
Right.
then you have the obligation issue of the church is told to care for the immigrant and the poor, but then we're putting that on society. What may be a good way to think through that is the idea of God governing a church different than he governs a nation or a country. I mean, basically, I feel like in the New Testament, those commands are given towards the church, but he views the whole world under a certain set of rules and all of that. Is that helpful to think through, or am I off on that?
Well, I don't think you're off, but I think it needs some clarification, because it's unquestionable that the Lord has standards that he expects his church to abide by. We could say live by. And many of these are laid out for us in the back end of the writings of Paul, to a lesser extent Peter, and John in the pages of the New Testament. And all of these, by the way, are well founded and grounded in the writings of the Old Testament in the Mosaic Code. So these leaders of Christian thinking have defined that this is these are the parameters by which we live, and these things are enjoined upon Christians that they ought to follow them as part of their Christianity. And so you'll sometimes hear people say that for those who depart from this and don't do it well, they're not Christian. Well, we can't ultimately say they're not Christian. Their belief might well be in the Lord Jesus, but they may not be living it out very well. And so this is why Paul, in one place, he says, now that you've done these things, now you ought to go on to do these things. So he's actually, if you will, speaking to them about a higher level of commitment and engagement with their faith and the lifestyle of faith. Now, when we talk about society, the fact is that God's rules, God's ways, how he would have humanity live is actually universal across society. And Lance Wallnau has popularized the idea of sheep nations and goat nations. I think what Lance is trying to say in that is, and I'm only using it because I know that many of our listeners would be familiar with him. But if you're not familiar, you don't need to go look him up to understand this idea. There are some nations that historically, traditionally, have tried to embody in their laws and in their way of life things that comport more closely with the ways of God. And there are some nations that seemingly have no sensibility about that. They either openly disregard it, the ways of God, or they may not openly disregard it. They may simply be unaware of it. And so, in the disregard category, we could talk about, well, much of Europe, and I could say even today, much of the United States and Australia and New Zealand. These countries were once viewed as Christian nations, and many of our laws were founded upon the teachings of Scripture in one way or another, because we were trying to order our lives and set our ethics and our legal codes in a way that would be pleasing to God. We were trying to build some sort of a version of God's righteousness into our societies. And I think we're all highly sensitized at this point to the fact that in many ways we've fallen short. We can think about, of course, the racial matter and slavery, although I would be quick to add that white Europe and white America and white Australia, for that matter, were not the only nations of the world to engage in slavery. Many nations that the ruling class were of other races or skin color often practiced slavery. For example, the Egyptians were a rather dark brown skinned people, and they famously and biblically enslaved the entire nation of Israel, and did so for 400 years. So slavery is not unique to white nations. More recently, it might have been put under a spotlight and seen to be so, but it's actually something that's existed throughout history. And we see blacks enslaving blacks and browns enslaving browns, and We could say yellow-skinned people enslaving yellow-skinned people, thinking of, for example, what the Japanese did to the Chinese in the rape of Nanjing during the Second World War. So slavery, just to be clear, is not uniquely Western. And by the way, it is Christian sentiment, whether through William Wilberforce or the Christian beliefs of the abolitionists in the United States, that slavery was ultimately, belatedly, abolished in what were once viewed as Christian lands. So that would be an example. We have certainly another example of falling short of our Christian or godly ideals with the way, for example, natives have been treated in various environments. I say natives rather than Native Americans because, of course, in America we do have Native Americans, but we can think of what happened not only in North America with what were once called American Indians. We can think of South America, but we can also think of what the Australians and by extension the British and Scots and Irish, but particularly the British, did to the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. And so, we can see the mistreatment, and I'm not talking about enslavement now as much as I am the taking of lands or the unjust killing of these people. All of this would fall into that category of certainly failing to live up to what we have espoused. And then we could think of women's suffrage. The scripture itself says there is neither, in Christ anyway, there is neither male nor female, which is not to say that the distinctions between male and female have been eliminated, but rather there is no superiority of male over female. The scripture says that this is the way it is to be, and yet I think everyone's aware that for long centuries, men continued to dominate society. We now live in a time where women are gaining more and more equality with men, as it should be. And so, these are just three examples of things where societies that were trying to live up to some sort of God-centric ideal failed to do so. But our failures, I don't think, mean that we should therefore cease attempting to live up to a God-centric ideal. It might mean that we need to pay more close attention to what we say we believe and then hold ourselves to greater account in carrying that out.
Yeah. I mean, as you deal with people that are in some sort of deconstruction or deconstructing from the faith or having problems with the faith or church hurt, you usually hear the same kinds of arguments about the negative things that have been inflicted on people that have espoused to be Christians have done, which is true and terrible, and we shouldn't be glossed over. At the same time, a predominant amount of good has also been propagated on the earth through the church. I'm thinking of the first schools, the first hospitals, the first breweries. We're all means to try and really see that shalom come upon the earth as it is in heaven here. So it is true. We need to acknowledge the shortcomings and sometimes the terrible mistreatment of people that is just inexcusable, and it makes you question whether or not they actually were Jesus followers. We can't cover that up, but we also at the same time can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because a lot of good has been done in the name of Jesus on the earth. And so I do think it's important that we continue to try to see earth come as it is in heaven, and the will of God happen. So when we're talking about just war and the idea of everyone moving forward and how that looks, and we understand the devastation of war, we probably know now more than ever of the brutality of it, and it does seem very against what we typically may think of when it comes to how a Christian should conduct themselves and all of that. It doesn't seem very far off from some of the things we read about in the Old Testament, where we see the Lord commanding the armies of Israel to go in and to take the land and to do those sort of things. And so help us think through that. How do we, as New Testament Christians, are we supposed to enact what we see in the Old Testament? Is that our guide? Is that how we look for it? Can you help us walk through that thought process?
Yeah, I think the Old Testament is actually probably a big enough area that we should maybe do a separate podcast on that at another time,
Agreed.
lest this one run too long. But I do want to come back to this idea of the framework for just war. Again, because for a lot of people, they really struggle to square the idea that Christians on any level might engage in war. And so with that, I want to go back to these 7 tenets of just war. And I'll just say one more time, I have not heard this described anywhere since I left university. I don't think this should just be in the institutions. I think it's something that needs to be part of our wider conversation. Part of why I wanted to do a kind of a segue out of the things we've been doing. We've been kind of alternating between people who are fivefold ministers and then the 7 principles of the New Reformation. But when we had Dan Juster on last week, and we talked about Hamas and the recent war with Israel, it got me thinking that we really should talk about this, because it is something that we see on our TV screens from time to time. And if it's not on our TV screens, it's in our news feed and our internet. And so let's talk about these 7 tenets that are articulated through the writings of St. Augustine and beyond, as we describe warfare. So the first tenet is this: a just war can only be waged as a last resort. So we don't just go to war. I'm using the word just 2 different ways here. We don't merely go to war. We go to war when we have no other options. We've exhausted all other options. And when we say all other options, we mean, of course, non-violent options before the use of force can be justified. Now, let's take a look at the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas. And on that one, why did Israel begin firing back at Hamas? Well, it was because in this particular round of the Middle East conflict, Hamas began firing rockets, which are unguided missiles. If they had a guidance mechanism, we would call them missiles properly. But Hamas began firing rockets into Israel. And we'll come to this point in a moment, but I'll add it right here. They were firing on civilian populations deliberately, and the word deliberately is very essential here. Well, I'm not in sort of the command position in Israel or its government, but I have to believe that when the firing of rockets began, through whatever channels of communication exist between the Israelis and Hamas, the Israelis were saying, stop this, don't do this. And, Hamas continued to do it. And in fact, by the time that exchange was over, I think I heard Dan Juster say that more than 4,100 rockets had been fired into Israel. Israel had returned fire, so we're not saying that they didn't do that, but there was a proportionality issue, which is another principle we're going to talk about. Hamas fired many, many more rockets, firing them on civilians. And so Israel, when they could not get Hamas to stop firing rockets into its territory, it was at that point that Israel began returning fire. So that's principle 1. War is a last resort, not a first resort. We can say with that, by the way, that war is not to be waged offensively. And so offensive warfare is when, we initiate the battle. Japan initiated conflict with the United States at Pearl Harbor. There was tension between the 2 nations, but we were still on some level engaging in diplomatic conversation until Tora, and then the bombing begins. Japan initiated something. When Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia and Poland, both of these were offensive operations. And so neither of these could be defined under the terms we're using here as just war. Historically, at least with regard to international affairs, the United States generally did not engage in offensive warfare. I say generally because it was not universally true. And certainly with regard to some of what went on, say, with Indian tribes or North American natives, There were some offensive operations that went on there. So I'm not saying that it's universally right, but when we think kind of the American ideal of war, the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, and that began the hostilities of the Civil War. And in that sense, the Union side was, at least on this point, in the right. I'm not saying they remained in the right or that everything they did was in the right, but at least on that one vector, they were in the right. When we think about World War I, of course, the Germans initiated World War I, and ultimately the US joined the war on the side of the British and the French, and Germany was defeated. But Germany fired the first shots. In the Second World War, we've already covered that. One of the major places that we broke with this tradition as a nation, America, was in the Second Gulf War, when we invaded Iraq with the objective of eliminating weapons of mass destruction. This is generally known as preemptive war. And a lot of theoreticians have said, there are times when you need to do this to prevent a greater damage down the road. And had it been right that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and was in fact about to use them against the United States, maybe people would have been more comfortable with it. But as the Second Gulf War unfolded, we found that in fact those weapons were never discovered, and so people became dubious of the idea that this was a just war because we were waging offensive war. So again, we can't be in an offensive posture if we're going to be waging just war. The majority of the wars that we think of, for example, in the Middle East, that have been waged have been defensive. The 1948 war against Israel, it's called the war against Israel because they didn't initiate it. There were some things that led to great tension. We could call them provocations in some ways, but Israel did not initiate that conflict, nor did they initiate the 67 war, nor did they initiate the 73 war, nor did they initiate the 82 war into Lebanon. That one's usually not talked about much, but all of these were wars where the other side started the shooting. But remember, just because a war starts just doesn't mean it remains just. So we have to go on to the other tenets of war. So a just war can only be waged as a last resort, and that means no offensive use of force in the sense that we initiate the war. Now, to win a war, there is offense and there is defense, just like there is in football. So that means you cannot, it's not to say that you cannot use offensive strategy. It's simply to say that we can't launch the war ourselves.
Right.
Okay. By the way, I just want to pause here. Somebody's going to ask about the Crusades, because someone's going to say, well, the Christians initiated the Crusades. In fact, the Crusades go back from before the time that Pope Urban II, preached in favor of the First Crusade, which was in the year 1098. In fact, all of those lands had at one time been Christian lands, and it was actually through the process of jihad in the 500s and 600s that ultimately the Middle East fell under Muslim control. And so whether you agree with it or not, I'm just helping people understand the logic. It was believed widely that the response of the Crusades was in fact a defensive action against an offense that had already occurred when the Muslims swept through and converted by force the Christians and many of the Jews who were still living in the Holy Land. Okay, let's go to principle 2. A war is just only if it is waged by a legitimate authority. So even just causes cannot be served by actions that are taken by individuals or groups. We might call them partisans, we might call them militias, who do not constitute an authority sanctioned by whatever the society and outsiders to the society deem legitimate. And this is one of the reasons why most of what we see in terrorism is not deemed to be just. I'm thinking of the Christians that were marched out on the beach in Libya in their orange jumpsuits under ISIS and who were beheaded. ISIS purported to be a legitimate state, but most of the world didn't view ISIS as a legitimate state. And so in that sense, we don't have a legitimate authority behind it. When we think of people, who are setting off shoe bombs on airplanes, or we think of what went on with 9/11, the hijacking of 4 jetliners, and the attempt to destroy buildings and to take those who are on the plane to their death with it. None of this is a legitimate authority. And so, this also rules out the possibility of, what we call militias, or, with it, even maybe a microcosm of it, a lot of the lynchings that went on in, earlier times in the United States and elsewhere. So none of this is a legitimate authority carrying it out. And one of the things that you will often hear on the left politically is they're very worried about militias. These are, organized groups that sort of form their own constitution and operational principles, but they're not sanctioned by the local government. That would be the National Guard. They're also not sanctioned by, and by the way, sanction sometimes is used the wrong way in popular discourse. Sanction comes from the word sanctus in Latin. Sanctus means holy. So if something is sanctioned, we're saying it's blessed. So a militia that is not, the National Guard is generally not viewed as blessed by the state or federal government. And so a war is just only if it's waged by a legitimate authority, the duly constituted authority of that nation. Now, there's a lot of ways to constitute government. In our system, it's a democratic election, but we recognize that there are other countries that have other ways of constituting their governments. We may not agree with them always. We may even deem them to be illegitimate. And that in turn becomes part of the reason why, as a nation, we might make war on that apparatus, because we view it as itself illegitimate. That's how we viewed ISIS. They called themselves the Islamic Caliphate, but we said this is actually not a legitimately constituted government.
Right.
All right, so that's principle 2. War is just only if it is waged by a legitimate authority. So fringe groups, sub-actors, things like this, they don't qualify. Number 3, a just war can only be fought to redress a wrong suffered. So self-defense against an armed attack is always considered to be a just cause, but the justice of the cause is not sufficient. We'll come back to that in a moment. So a just war can only be fought with the right intentions, and the only permissible objective in a just war is to redress the injury. So let's go back to the Middle East and let's think about Gulf War I. Now, in Gulf War I, Iraq had invaded Kuwait. And of course, many people said it was an oil war, that was really why the US went there. Well, I don't think that withstands scrutiny for this reason. The United States did not retain the oil wells and the valuable production assets of Kuwait after we had won the Gulf War. We, in fact, returned all of that to the nation of Kuwait. Normally, wars of expropriation are when somebody goes in to seize land or other valuable assets that the attacking nation wants for itself. So why was the US at war in Gulf War I? Because Kuwait was an ally of ours, and we, of course, recognized the strategic threat that Iraq posed to the world's oil supply by making the move that it had, and both because Kuwait was an ally that we were bound to defend by treaty, and because of the potential strategic threat to the world's oil supply, it was deemed that this was an acceptable thing to do. So that means, using this rubric that we're describing here, Gulf War I was a just war, but Gulf War II was not. And I think a lot of times people lose that distinction. It's for this same reason that the Second World War was a just war. We were attacked, and then we went to war not only against Japan, but against its allies, Germany and Italy. And of course, in Germany, in Europe, there had been grievous offenses. Initially, the U.S. attempted to maintain neutrality, but actually, by long tradition, linguistically, economically, militarily, in other ways as well, religiously, ethnically. I mean, there were a lot of ties between the United States and these nations of the West that we ultimately sided with. The French had been our allies in the Revolutionary War. Of course, we'd famously had a fight with Britain called the Revolutionary War, but once we patched that up, we'd been on pretty good terms with them after the War of 1812. So what we saw, though, was that Germany had initiated offensive operations against France after having defeated the Czech and the Poles. They also initiated offensive operations against the British by the Battle of Britain and the bombing of London in particular. And so in looking at the fact that we ourselves had been attacked at Pearl Harbor, and in looking at what the Germans had done to our allies with their offensive against multiple nations in Europe, we were saying that we were redressing a wrong that had been suffered both by us as well as by our allies. So that's principle 3. Principle
you might get to this.
Go ahead.
You might get to this as some of the other principles, if not how we got into the war may have been just, but how we finished it might be another topic of discussion. Right,
Absolutely.
in regards to the just war thing. Okay, just want to make
Absolutely.
sure
We're getting there. We just haven't gotten there yet. And so, but I've said it already a couple times. So let's highlight it because you're pointing it out. It is possible to have a war begin justly and end unjustly.
Okay.
And so, just as we can say, it doesn't do you any good to begin as a Christian and fail to end life well as a Christian, just so we have to be very careful and scrupulous about how we wage war, because even if it was started correctly, it may not end correctly. Here's an example of that. In the Civil War, we've already said that the Confederates actually fired the first shot by firing on Fort Sumter. And then, the battle was joined. Of course, the South calls this the War of Northern Aggression. And they viewed many of the things that were going on politically and elsewhere as part of the aggression of the North. But in fact, there was no actual conflict in the sense of a hot war or a shooting war going on until Fort Sumter. But once the war began, let us not forget the General Sherman's march to the sea and the complete obliteration of the city of Atlanta as part of that. Sherman deemed it a necessary thing to do in order to subjugate the South, to get them to capitulate. The historians have debated this literally since the war ended. So about 160 years. But the bottom line is the indiscriminate use of force and the righting of wrongs, that sort of went by the wayside in the Civil War. And one could, I think, easily make the argument that although the cause of liberating slaves was a just one, that wasn't the reason we had the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation wasn't signed until 1863, and the Civil War started in 1861. So if the emancipation of slaves were in fact the casus belli, as they would say in Latin, then the Emancipation Proclamation would have had to precede the initiation of conflict in the Civil War. All right, so let's keep going. The fourth principle of a just war is the war can only be just if it is fought with a reasonable chance of success. So death and injury incurred in a hopeless cause are actually not morally justifiable. And so an example of this one might be the Battle of Kursk, which was on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. Hitler had held off on initiating hostilities with the Russians for a time, but when he thought he had things pretty well under control on the Western Front, he opened hostilities on the Eastern Front, and 20 million civilian casualties ensued on the Russian side, and it was a wholesale slaughter of the German army itself. Most of the Eastern German army was destroyed, annihilated in the Eastern Front War. And so this war, I mean, we've already said that the Second World War on Hitler's side was unjust, but yet another dimension of that was this Eastern Front conflict, because prior to that time, there hadn't been conflict on the Eastern Front. It was a militarized front. I'm sure there was some border skirmishing that went on, but it wasn't wholesale conflict. But when Hitler launched it, it was actually impossible for him to win that conflict, and he destroyed many of his own people as well as the civilians that were in Kursk and Leningrad and so forth. All of this area just became scorched earth. And so in that sense, the war was unjust because there was no reasonable chance of success, no reasonable chance of success. This, by the way, becomes part of the logic behind surrender. When we realize that the only option we have to avoid death is surrender, that's the time that we should do it. But if we think we might prevail in battle, then we are allowed to fight on. So in the Second World War, again, I'm trying to give examples that people might identify with. Many of the Japanese soldiers in the Pacific were under strict orders never to surrender, even if the island was surrounded by the American Navy, even if the American soldiers had gained supremacy on the ground, even if they were being closed in on, there was no support coming. They knew that they would never be able to prevail in battle. They would simply be liquidated. They were still under orders to fight to the death. And in that sense, again, that dimension or that facet of the Second World War in the Pacific became immoral because the Japanese were actually destroying their own people. And one of the things that any nation ought to do is seek to bring as many of its soldiers and sailors and airmen home alive as they possibly can. All right, the fifth principle of just war is that the ultimate goal of a just war is to reestablish peace. So the peace established after the war must be preferable to the peace that would have prevailed if the war had not been fought. Now, there could be a lot of differences of opinion about this. Is this final state of nature actually better than the former state of nature? So let's go back to the Gulf War that George W. Bush initiated, Gulf War II. We've already said by these terms, it wasn't really a just war. But one of George W. Bush's points of logic on that conflict was, he said, we are going to establish democracy in the Middle East, as it were, making the world safe for democracy. And this will be a better form of government for the many, for the people of the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, than they would have been under had Saddam Hussein continued in power with his torture chambers and some of the things that he was known to have done and that were proven to have been done. I mean, this wasn't mere propaganda. In the end, the final state is better than the beginning state, and therefore this is justifiable. That's really what that principle is after. And again, there could be a lot of conflict and debate internally within the body politic about whether the final state of peace is in fact better than the former state, but we'll take that just as a given at this point rather than go further with it. The sixth principle of just war, and this is a very important one, and you kind of brought it up, Grant, is the principle of proportionality. The violence used in the war must be proportional to the injury suffered. And so states are prohibited from using force not necessary to attain the limited objective of addressing the injury that had previously been suffered. Now, this has a lot of applicability throughout the history of humanity. If we think of the Romans and we think of the famous speech that was given, I believe it was by Seneca in the Roman Forum, he ended his speech with Carthago delenda est, which is Latin for Carthage must be destroyed. Now, this was obviously going on in the Carthaginian Wars, but when the Romans came to Carthage, they didn't merely subjugate Carthage, they salted the earth so that nothing could even grow there again. They literally sought the obliteration of a civilization. That's not proportionality. Another example would be what the Romans did when they defeated Jerusalem in 70 AD. More than 1 million people were put to death as part of that conflict. Now, that might have been just the casualty count, except that it wasn't just the casualty count. This is actually verging into point 7, that we are not allowed to target non-combatants. We're not allowed to target civilians. This is one of the reasons that the Hamas war that just recently found a truce, I don't think they actually got a peace treaty out of it, The Hamas war was immoral on the Hamas side in that they were indiscriminately firing rockets into civilian areas of Israel, seeking to harm civilians. Well, that's what the Romans did when they destroyed Jerusalem. They put 1 million people to the sword. They crucified the men. They raped all the women. I mean, all of this is unjust warfare as this is described. When we look at some of the things that the U.S. Army did in dealing with what was deemed the Indian problem, many times non-combatants were targeted, women, children, as well as the Braves, or what were, that was their term for the warriors. So this is indiscriminate killing. Now, this brings us to a very interesting question, and it deals with the weapons of mass destruction. And this is really the problem with all what are called ABC weapons: atomic, biological, and chemical. These are non-discriminate weapons. They don't merely target those who are the combatants. A rifle bullet can be aimed at, one person. It might miss, it might by accident hit somebody who's a bystander, who's a non-combatant. We call this collateral damage. But the intention of rifles, of guided missiles, things like this, is that they are quite discriminatory. They deliberately seek to kill only combatants rather than non-combatants. Whereas when we go to an ABC type weapon of any kind, doesn't matter which one, and again, ABC stands for atomic, biological, and chemical, or bacteriological. That's the other word that is sometimes used. When we use these kinds of weapons, we know what happened when the atom bombs were dropped on Japan. There were indiscriminate killing of civilians. When Dresden was firebombed in the Second World War, indiscriminate killing of civilians. In the bombing of London, which I think Dresden was a retaliation for the bombing of London, the Nazi bombers came over and they firebombed the city, and much of it burned to the ground, and many, many civilians were killed in collapsing buildings, shrapnel from the bombs, etc. So we've seen plenty of examples of this in the history of warfare. Biological weapons, by their nature, you release this bioactive agent. If you are one of those who believe that COVID was in fact a bioweapon that the Chinese were developing, look at I think our body count now is nearing 4 million people globally who died as a result of this, and yet they were never combatants against the Chinese in any sense. And chemical weapons have much the same effect. This, by the way, is one of the reasons that when President Obama fired on the Syrians, when Bashar Assad was gassing Syrian civilians in Syria, one of Obama's justifications for doing so was that Assad was targeting civilians as well as combatants. And so this is one of the reasons people really do not like weapons of mass destruction. I mean, we sort of recoil in horror at the, thousands of people who can be killed this way, and we should. I'm not in any way legitimizing it. I'm just saying that what we often don't hear about is the fact that these things might be used ostensibly with a militaristic purpose to kill combatants only, but by their nature, these things are non-discriminatory, and we have a wider death toll.
Right.
And then the seventh principle: the weapons used in war must discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. So this ties right into this proportionality. Civilians are never permissible targets of war, and every effort must be taken to avoid killing civilians. The death of civilians is justified only if they are the unavoidable victims of a deliberate attack on a military target. Let's say that again. The death of civilians is justified only if they are unavoidable victims of a deliberate attack on a military target. And so with that, let's go back to the Hamas war, because, there were demonstrations in the streets, and once again, Israel was pilloried because civilians in Gaza were being killed. There's something going on with this, and Dan kind of made comment of it. And again, this is part of why I wanted to talk about just war on this podcast. There's something going on with what happened in Gaza that I don't think many people realize. Hamas routinely houses weapons, and not just like weapons that are being stored for future use. They actually launch rockets out of hospitals and schools, and similar kinds of places, mosques, where you would logically expect to find non-combatants. Hospitals, of course, where there are sick people who couldn't be combatants, schools where children are, mosques where presumably people are worshiping. But they routinely house weapons there. And one of the things that Israel does when they're going to attack something like that, it's a valid, legitimate military objective to take out those sites because they are the source of offensive combat, and they want to destroy those rocket launchers. But one of the things Israel will commonly do, and the US has done this as well in many cases, not universally, but many cases, is they'll either drop pamphlets or leaflets in the local language saying, get out of here. This area is going to be targeted. You don't want to be here. You could be hurt if you stay around. You could be killed if you stay around. Sometimes they'll fly helicopters over, with loudspeakers, and in this case saying in Arabic, get out, get out, get out. You've got 5 minutes to leave. Leave now, leave now, leave now. Now, if people either can't leave or choose not to leave, Israel, at least in this rubric that we're describing, is no longer morally culpable. And in fact, the blame shifts to Hamas because they have placed their weapons in locations where it's almost inevitable that civilians are going to be killed. And so we hear this kind of language emerge: human shields. And what we mean by that is that Hamas is using non-combatants of whatever sort they may be, the sick and injured, children, worshipers in mosques, whatever. These people, Hamas doesn't really care, or they don't care enough that their own people may be killed. They use them as shields seeking to deter the Israelis from attacking. This is the same reason, on a much larger canvas, that somebody might take a hostage holding them like this with a gun at their head. And when we're doing this, what's happening? Well, the hostage taker is saying, if you try to kill me, I'll kill this person. And so this person is being held that way in order that you will not kill me. Hamas really tries to do this on a large scale with its own civilian population, because they have, if you will, usurped the control of government. It's not completely clear whether Hamas is a legitimate government. On the one hand, they are elected, but the elections are rigged, and there are other factions within Gaza that would much rather not have a Hamas government, and who are working actively to oust Hamas. And because of the way the elections were conducted, they would say this is an illegitimate government. So on that vector as well, the things that Hamas is doing are no longer subject to the tenets of just war. So as you can see, and I'm trying to give lots of examples to help people think through this, because if I just throw out the principles, they may not be able to connect the dots. And I've used multiple examples from different periods of history in defining this. But these are the 7 tenets of just war, and I'll restate them now for the record. A just war can only be waged as a last resort. All nonviolent options must be exhausted before the use of force can be justified. Number 2, a war is just only if it is waged by a legitimate authority. Even just causes cannot be served by actions taken by individuals or groups who do not constitute an authority that is sanctioned or authorized by whatever the society itself and the outsiders to the society deem legitimate. Number 3, just war can only be fought to redress a wrong suffered. For example, self-defense against an armed attack is always considered to be a just cause, although the justice of the cause is not sufficient, as we already discussed and will come to on our next point. A just war can only be fought with the right intentions, and the only permissible objective of a just war is to redress the injury. Number 4, a war can only be just if it is fought with a reasonable chance of success. So death and injury incurred in a hopeless cause is not morally justifiable. And let me just pause on that point for a moment. This is the reason why, for example, the Children's Crusade during the Crusades, which went on for about 200 years, the Children's Crusade was an unjust war, or an unjust crusade, whereas the First Crusade, at least arguably, I'm not saying unquestionably, but arguably was just. So there were these different phases of the Crusades, and this is an example of how something that began arguably justly, in the end, ended up unquestionably unjust. Number 5, the ultimate goal of a just war is to reestablish peace, and specifically the peace that is envisioned, or the peace that is established after the war, must be preferable to the one that would have prevailed if the war had never been fought. 6th point, the violence used in the war must be proportional to the injury suffered. So proportionality. In other words, you can't pull out an atomic bomb just because somebody shot 20 people in a supermarket as an act of war. That violates the principle of proportionality. You can't destroy an entire town razing it to the ground, R-A-Z-I-N-G. You can't raze an entire town to the ground because a sniper in a tower killed a military person, even a general, on your side. That violates the principle of proportionality. So states are prohibited from using force not necessary to obtain the limited objective of addressing the injury suffered. By the way, let me just give one more excursus on that point. This was part of the argument used on why the bombing of Japan with atomic weapons was in fact justified, because it was pretty well understood that the Japanese would fight to the absolute last person, and the casualty count was expected to exceed at least 1 million people on the US side, and probably multiples of that on the Japanese side if the invasion had commenced. And so the atomic bombing of 2 cities, despite the tens of thousands of casualties, that was viewed as preferable to the kind of unrestricted warfare that would have been necessary to subdue the whole of the Japanese chain. And so this was viewed as actually more proportional than unrestricted warfare on the Japanese quote unquote mainland. Again, I'm not saying you have to agree with that logic. I'm just trying to help you understand what was in the minds of the war planners in an era where these matters were very much on the minds of those who were running the war. And the 7th principle of just war, the weapons used in war must discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. We've already covered why ABC weapons are intrinsically immoral in this sense, and civilians are never permissible targets of war, and every effort must be taken to avoid killing civilians. The death of civilians is justified only if they are the unavoidable victims of a deliberate attack on a known military target. All right, there we go. Questions?
Well, I think my question would be, I think that's interesting and all of that, but one of the things that I've thought of as we're going through this is I'd like to ask you, why do you feel like this is important for us right now? Like what's prompted this, other than the thing, because you and I have talked offline about this, that you felt like there was kind of an urgency, a need to get this into our minds. So could you just talk to that? I mean, other than just being a great history lesson or an ethics lesson, right. I know you don't do anything unintentionally. So what was the thing that sparked this?
Well, I think, in our time, it particularly because of social media, but also the shifting sentiments of society, I think it's easy for people to be whipped into a frenzy, into an outrage, about things that are going on, and this ought not to be. And we certainly saw a recent example of it with some of the demonstrations in Europe, which were blatantly anti-Semitic against Israel during this recent conflict with Hamas. And as we were talking with Dan Juster, the thought occurred to me, we should really explore this, because there would be a lot of Christians, whether they're really deeply Christian or they're just sort of lean Christian, who would not necessarily side with Israel in this most recent conflict, or who are, in the back of their mind, they're still kind of pondering, was the Gulf War justified? Was the Second Gulf War justified? Was even World War II justified? And so what I'm trying to do in this is I'm trying to help people who hear these reports and things. I'm helping them to think Christianly about whether any given particular situation started out just to begin with, or ultimately maintained its justice, or fell into being an unjust war, even if the initial casus belli was justifiable. And I think that's helpful for us, because I don't think we want to be just unequivocally pacifist. I think, at the level of society, if governments are instituted to bear the sword, then presumably the scripture itself contemplates that there will be at least some subset of times where the war might be legitimate. And in that, we need to think about, well, when is that time, so that we don't end up supporting a cause of war that actually should never have garnered support.
No, that's good. I think having grounded historical Christian thought is very much needed to keep us from both sides. Jesus never came for a side, right? And so the Christian way is going to cause both the right and left of whatever it is
That's exactly right.
Come under question and come under criticism and all of that. And I think we're too easily swinging to one side or the other. And that's just, I don't see Jesus there. I see Jesus, straddling that, as we say in the Vineyard, radical middle between those two tensions. So I appreciate bringing this to mind, and hopefully this isn't prophetic. Hopefully we don't have to think about this.
Yeah.
And it's something else, but yeah, I think this is certainly a fresh topic that needs to be brought to light. So I appreciate you taking it.
Let's do a quick run through of two conflicts that we could just drop this template on. Let's go back to the Hamas war because it's so fresh in our minds.
Okay.
A just war can only be waged as a last resort. Well, Hamas actually initiated the war, but they hadn't run out of options. Dan mentioned on the podcast that although there were these 6 Palestinian homes in play, they hadn't yet gone to the Supreme Court of Israel. Maybe that would have been overturned at the Supreme Court level. So it clearly was not a last resort. But when Israel got involved in conflict with Hamas, it was a last resort on their side because Hamas had been firing on them. War is just if only waged by a legitimate authority. Well, in Israel's case, the government of Israel was waging the war. Some would say the Israeli government is itself not legitimate, but most of those people would be folks that are calling for the elimination of Israel. Most of the world body recognizes Israel as a legitimate authority. They are a member of the United Nations, etc. Point 3, war can only be fought to redress a wrong suffered. Well, Israel was fighting back because of rockets that had been fired into its territory. You could argue that Hamas was fighting back, but again, we hadn't fulfilled the first requirement that all other options had been exhausted yet. So they weren't yet fighting to redress a wrong that had been fully suffered. War is just only fought with a reasonable chance of success. Well, Hamas knew they would never beat the Israeli military. So in that sense, it was not a just war. One could argue that the Israelis maybe didn't have a chance of success, but in fact, they're pretty good at targeting things. And had they needed to, they could have launched a ground offensive. They didn't in this case. And I'm not trying to sound like an Israeli partisan here. I'm simply dropping the template on a conflict that we all watched happen in the news recently. The ultimate goal of a just war, is to reestablish peace. Hamas doesn't want peace with Israel. They've already stated their goal is the destruction of the Jewish state. It's in their charter. Israel wanted to reestablish peace. Prior to the firing of those rockets, the two nations they may not have liked each other. There may have been tension on the border, but they weren't shooting at each other. Israel just wanted the shooting to stop. Number 6, the violence used in the war must be proportional to the injury suffered. Well, Israel fired far fewer missiles into Gaza than the Hamas fired into Israel. So in that sense, it was proportional. And then finally, the weapons used in war must discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. Israel engages very specifically in highly targeted operations against, again, launch sites. They might be based in mosques and schools and hospitals, but Hamas has put them there, not the Israelis. Whereas Hamas was fighting, just targeting non-combatants, civilian populations, because of Israel's defenses and their civil defense protocols. They suffered fewer casualties, but the potential was there for far greater casualties on the Israeli side. So if we go down the list, it appears that Israel, by and large, we could have some legitimate and honest debate about a couple of these, but for the most part, Israel was waging just war in the Hamas conflict. Hamas was not. Another one that we could turn our attention to is when Ronald Reagan initiated the invasion of Grenada. And ultimately, we went on to try to snag Noriega in Central America. Well, it's not clear that this was our last resort. So right out of the gate, the United States was not waging a just war in that conflict. It was waged by a legitimate authority. So in that sense, okay, check the box too. The United States government was waging it against the forces of Noriega, which was also a legitimate government. Again, we might argue that the election was stolen, et cetera, but it was the governing body of the nation. A just war can only be fought to redress a wrong suffered. Well, it's not fully clear what wrong we had suffered with all of that conflict. So maybe we're out of the box on number 3 also. A war can only be just if it is fought with a reasonable chance of success. All right, well, there was very little doubt we were going to win. So we're good on 2 and 4. We're not so good on 1 and 3. Point 5, the ultimate goal of the war is to establish peace, reestablish peace. Okay, we did that, so maybe we're all right there. The violence must be proportional to the injury suffered. Well, wasn't clear what the injury was, but I guess in some sense it was proportional, maybe, arguably. And then point 7, the weapons must discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. In general, the U.S. is pretty careful not to target non-combatants. There have been some notable examples where this wasn't true, particularly in the Vietnam conflict. But when we look at that particular Central American conflict, I think we pretty well minded our P's and Q's. So we cleared the bar on 5 of the 7, but not on numbers 1 and 3. On those 2, we're out of the box. So we would have to say that even if we are Republican partisans, Ronald Reagan's war in Central America against in Grenada and then on to Nicaragua, this was actually not truly a just war as articulated.
All right. Well, I think that's probably a good place to land the plane this time, and a lot to think about. And hopefully we don't have to apply this soon in the future to anything that
I agree with that.
Yeah, that is going on. So, but this is good to help us process current events through a Christian lens. So thank you so much for taking time to be with us, and thank you guys for joining us and listening in. And we look forward to seeing you right back here next week with another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish.
If you are blessed by the content on this podcast, please pay it forward and click on the donation link in the description of this episode. To support Ken directly, you can select the Ken Fish Support Fund. Or, if you would like to give to support the rest of the team, select the General Fund. Thank you so much for your consideration. We are deeply grateful to all of our financial partners.